All right, today we're going to talk about the end of the Jimmy Johnson-Jerry Jones partnership in Dallas. And to do this, I want to bring in a sort of a popular theory that's bounced around for a couple of decades now. This theory has been championed by Tim Cowlishaw of the Dallas Morning News. And Cowlishaw suggests that it was Jimmy Johnson's plan all along to get out of Dallas. That it was Johnson who played Jerry Jones. That Jimmy wasn't fully committed to the Cowboys anymore. That he basically manipulated Jerry into asking him to leave the Cowboys, at which suggestion Johnson was only too willing to jump. I first became aware of Cowlishaw's stance back around 2009, 2010, and for several years I wondered about it. I didn't really think it was true, but Cowlishaw's reasoning and the facts that he presented to support his claims, I couldn't argue with. It seemed to make sense, but I still wondered. Now here we are, years later, and having researched that era of Cowboys history in depth, today I'm going to explain why Cowlishaw's theory is wrong, that it is not supported by history, that really it's just a misinterpretation of the structure of power back in Dallas during the Jimmy Jerry years. And before I go any further, let me just make one point clear. No, I'm not bashing Tim Cowlishaw here. I love Tim Cowlishaw's work, always have. Enjoy seeing him on ESPN as well. But there is some critically important history, some forgotten history here, that not only needs to come to light, but needs to be understood in its proper context. Okay, so the Jimmy Jerry rift. Not going to unearth every event here, every argument that popped up between the two, but needless to say, Jerry Jones wanted to be given more credit among fans and among the press for various moves the Cowboys made over time, and Jimmy Johnson didn't play along with this. Jerry wanted to be viewed as a football guy, and Jimmy wasn't willing to cater to him. You know, if anything, Johnson tended to needle back at every opportunity. I'll just focus on the last few months of their partnership, when everything started unraveling. Okay, so leading up to the final weekend of the 1993 regular season, before what was basically an NFC East championship game against the Giants at the Meadowlands, Johnson had finally had enough of Jones and his meddling ways, and declared that, hey, he wouldn't mind if he became the coach of the expansion Jacksonville Jaguars. Jerry, understandably, took exception to this, and thus infuriated, Jones began doing what he had been doing already for the past 2.5 seasons, insisting that it was a team effort at the top in Dallas, that the Cowboys' success in recent years wasn't due to the brilliance of just their head coach. According to Jerry, owner and coach communicated about football issues constantly. A few weeks later, during Super Bowl week leading up to Super Bowl 28, Johnson shot down the notion, saying that he and Jerry only talked once a week, which was, another way of saying that Jerry wasn't involved in the football side of things at all. As ugly as it was, it could have gotten a lot uglier, but fortunately, the Cowboys take care of business. They beat the Bills for their second straight championship, and everything seemed to die down between head coach and owner. However, everything boiled over in the middle of March at the owners' meeting in Orlando. Jerry walks up to a table one evening, where Jimmy is seated, along with a handful of current Dallas assistants and former Dallas assistants who worked under Jimmy Johnson. Norv Turner was there. He had just become the head coach of the Washington Redskins. Dave Wanstead was there. He was going into his second year as the Chicago Bears head coach. Tony Wise was there. I think Butch Davis was there too. Anyway, Jones walks up and proposes a toast. The suggestion wasn't received very well, apparently. Jones takes offense, utters a curse word, and storms out. By the wee hours of the morning, Jones is hung over at a bar, and in the presence of at least 2 members of the working press, he declares an infatuation with a new idea. By golly, he would fire Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy was nothing. There were 500 coaches who could win the Super Bowl with such a great Cowboys team as this. That's it. He would hire Barry Switzer to coach the Cowboys instead. Predictably, as you can imagine, by morning Jones's words had spread, all over the hotel certainly, but really all over the nation. And when Jimmy heard about it, he just got mad and left the owners' meetings. He's out of here. And 1 week later, Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson officially parted ways. Now, Tim Cowlishaw suggests that Jimmy had been plotting for this exit for some time. Cowlishaw brings up the fact that Johnson, at Super Bowl 28, had his boat docked, and immediately after the celebration, he then sailed down to Miami, where he was planning to eventually move into a house. By itself, it's a kind of a suggestive fact. I mean, it might depend upon how one interprets it. Johnson, he may have been plotting an escape, as Cowlishaw suggests, or he may have been anxious just to get away from Jerry, from football, and from the Cowboys as soon as the initial Super Bowl celebration was over. It could have been that he just simply wanted to unplug for a brief time. Who knows? But there's another fact that Cowlishaw brings up which is very, very interesting. Cowlishaw believes that Johnson never intended to coach the Cowboys in '94, that he was no longer committed to the team. Why does he say this? Because, as of the day he left the team on March 29th, Johnson had not watched any film to prepare for the NFL draft. Wow. When I heard that tidbit many years ago, I was stumped. It was strange. I had never heard anything like that of any head coach at the NFL level, and really it was the last thing I would have expected from a head coach such as Jimmy Johnson, who had a reputation as one of the most driven, most prepared coaches in the league. Like I stated earlier, I wondered about this for many years, and I knew that the day would come, sooner or later, when I would research this issue and find out the truth, if at all possible. Because, let's be honest, Cowlishaw's conclusion might very well, be based upon a presumption. Almost what you might consider a very natural presumption. I mean, who ever heard of an NFL head coach not preparing for the college draft? That's not normal. That's absurd. But I had to ask myself the question, was it actually normal for Jimmy in Dallas? That was the question I wanted an answer to when I started researching the Jimmy Jerry years. And before very long, I actually got an answer. It was the custom in Dallas. Every year, it was the assistant coaches for the Cowboys who did the preliminary work for the NFL draft. They did all the film study, most of the interviews, and so forth. Jimmy would come in anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks before the draft and just immerse himself in the task, pour himself heart and soul into the draft, getting up to speed and getting ready. That was how it worked in Dallas every year. Which brings us back to that night at the owners' meeting in Orlando, and brings us back to one of the most overlooked layers of the Jimmy Jerry feud. When Jerry Jones walked up to that table and proposed a toast, let's remember that he was proposing a toast to the same assistant coaches that he had refused to give a raise to in past years, a financial raise. Jimmy, many times, had practically begged him to give the staff members a raise. It was well known back in the early 90s, that the Cowboys had one of the smallest scouting staffs in the league, which meant more of a workload in college scouting for the assistants. It was well known that the Cowboys did not have a pro personnel director, and it was well known that the Cowboys had one of the most overworked and underpaid staffs in the league. All of this didn't seem to bother Jerry at all. Jerry, from seemingly every vantage point, didn't really appreciate the staff, which wasn't Jimmy's style at all. Now, just before flying to Orlando for the owners' meeting, Johnson had treated his staff to a couple of days in the Bahamas, where they spent some time relaxing on the beach and some time at the gambling tables. Jimmy Johnson was well known for being generous to his assistants. Jimmy, he won big on the football field, but He had a habit of winning big while gambling as well, and then turning right around and giving the profits away to his coaches. It was nothing for Johnson to give away $2,000 at a time. It was nothing. So when Jerry proposed a toast, it was a way of inferring that he was one of the guys, which was what Jerry was always trying to do. But the irony is that he wasn't one of the guys, and everyone at the table there that night knew it. Instead, Jerry was a cheapskate. He wasn't a benefactor, he was a tightwad, and it was his tight-fistedness that had affected every person at that table in one fashion or another over the years. And that's a big reason why Jerry got the half-hearted response that he did. So, to conclude that Jimmy wasn't committed to the team any longer just because he hadn't prepared for the draft as of March 29th is not fair to the structure of operation at that time in Dallas. It doesn't account for how Jimmy ran his program with the Cowboys. Yes, Jimmy had basically turned the 1994 draft over to Larry Lacewell, which was a marked difference than in past years when Jimmy ran the whole draft ship. But when Jimmy got back to Dallas on the weekend after the Orlando fiasco, the first thing on his agenda, once the very much needed meeting with Jerry took place, once that was out of the way, it was to personally start preparing for the draft. It was, in fact, business as usual. And let's be honest, there was a lot on Jimmy's plate that he was dealing with in the spring of '94. It was the second year of open free agency, and it was the first year of the salary cap in the NFL. So it wasn't as if he was sitting on his rear end for 2 months doing nothing while his assistants slaved away in the film room. It wasn't as if he was out playing golf. In fact, Johnson had given up all charity golf engagements that spring. Why? Because he said he didn't have time to do it. He needed to get work done at the office. But there's more to this Jimmy-Jerry divorce that needs to be unpacked here. Another fact that has never been appreciated, and for my money, a fact that Jerry Jones would rather not be appreciated. Okay, so let's once more go back briefly to Orlando. After Jones's barroom comments went viral, Jerry had to face the media. Jimmy's gone, so it's up to Jerry to talk about it to the world. And when he did, Jones started blowing all this smoke about how he had been taking measures in recent months to protect the Cowboys financially in the event that Jimmy should decide to quit, or in the case he had to fire Jimmy, and so forth. Just all this smoke to give the impression that he, Jerry Jones, had the Cowboys' best interests at heart, that it was he who was protecting the integrity of the franchise's long-term vision. He was keeping all that intact, and not Jimmy. This scene, Jerry, holding court in front of reporters, it was later described by Frank Luxa of the Dallas Morning News as a, quote, first-person pronoun filibuster. That's really good. For my money, it was just a bunch of bull, a complete snow job, a fabrication of the highest order. And I say all that because of one fact that I came across in my research, and it has to do with the contract that Jimmy Johnson and Jerry Jones worked under, their agreement. Okay, to explain this, let's fast forward to the Monday after the Orlando nightmare. Jimmy and Jerry finally meet to iron out their differences and settle on a plan for the future. Whatever was going to happen between the pair was expected to happen on Monday, but it didn't turn out that way. The two met for 2.5 hours and had what both termed as a, quote, productive meeting, and promised to return on the next day and settle it all. Nothing concrete had been determined, but supposedly a list of 5 possible scenarios had been whittled down to 2. Ruled out as a possibility was Jimmy quitting. So Jimmy wasn't going to quit. Also ruled out was Jerry firing Jimmy. That wasn't going to happen either. And also eliminated from the realm of possibility was the two working together under their current agreement, which still had 5 years remaining on it. That left just 2 possibilities. Jimmy Johnson would either stay for one more year and coach the Cowboys in 94, or he would accept a settlement and be gone. That was the story given by Jerry to the media. But what if I told you that most of it was simply a bunch of smoke? What if I told you the truth of the matter? What if I told you the truth of the original agreement that Jerry and Jimmy had agreed to way back in 1989? What if I told you that truth? What if I told you that 2 of the 3 possibilities, which had supposedly just been eliminated, were not actually possibilities at all? Because here's the truth. Per their original agreement, Jimmy Johnson could not quit. And Jerry Jones could not fire Jimmy Johnson. Any decision to part ways had to be mutual. That was in writing, a clause that lawyers for each party were very well aware of. And that's why, at the next day's press conference to announce their parting of the ways, Jimmy Johnson phrased his words in the fashion that he did.
We have mutually decided that I would no longer be the head football coach with the Dallas Cowboys.
We have mutually decided that I would no longer be the head football coach of the Dallas Cowboys. That was for the lawyers. That's what those words were about. And a legal acknowledgement that each party had satisfactorily honored the terms of the contract. Later on in the press conference, Jerry Jones used the same term, quote, mutually agreed. So both parties had uttered the magic phrase, thereby nullifying any chance of one party suing the other at a later date. Which leads me into my reasoning for why I believe Jerry Jones to be the villain in this drama. Because it is Jerry, I believe, who orchestrated Johnson's dismissal, not the other way around. Okay, Tuesday morning, the day of the press conference announcing the divorce. Tuesday morning started with Jerry's lawyer and Jimmy's lawyer working on terms for a new 1-year contract. Okay, but there was a hang-up. Jerry wasn't going to make any deal that didn't leave him in total control of all personnel and football-related decisions. This was the very same clause that Jerry had been trying to get changed in their contract for almost 3 years. He wanted the power, but Jimmy had yet to give it to him. But this time was different. Jimmy saw the handwriting on the wall. That this was a standoff that could only end one way. Jerry had already called Barry Switzer and knew that Switzer was ready, able, and willing to be the next head coach of the Dallas Cowboys. He knew what that meant. Jerry could have sat back, and he could have let Jimmy run the team for 1 more year and then watch him ride off into the sunset. Jerry had already knocked 4 years off their agreement. But the lust for power was too much. Jimmy was tired, he was worn down, and he was weary of being the bad guy, just in order to maintain leverage with Jerry and in order to keep his players on their toes. And Jerry wanted what he thought was his due credit for what he thought was something of an inevitable three-peat in 94. Jerry Jones wanted the spotlight for himself. So when Jerry made a stink about the same contract issue again, Jimmy threw in the towel. He agreed to a settlement and got out of town. It didn't have to end that way. And Jimmy didn't want it to end that way. The only one who did was the same person who so easily could have prevented it. And that's Jerry Jones.